So on our app, we have certified listeners, and anybody who wants to call in any time of day, 24/7, 365, can join our app and you find a listener. And you can either do a general dispatch and we'll find someone who's a good match for you, or you can look at the different listener bios, and if they're online, you can talk to them, or you can schedule a call.
Welcome to Business Ninjas, brought to you by WriteForMe, where you'll hear from business leaders who are out there growing their business and slaying it every day. Learn from the masters. Let's get started.
Hello, this is John Gerard here with the Business Ninjas podcast, and I have an amazing guest with me today, Adi Segal, who's the CEO of Hapi. Hapi is a business that lives up to its name, and we're going to hear about how Adi and his team are doing that. And we've got a really interesting discussion today. Adi, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, John. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So tell people a little bit, if you will, just high level. What is Hapi? I know what happiness is, I think, but tell me about the business Hapi.
That's a great place to start because our name, I think, often is a misnomer with the services we provide. It's a clever tech name. We got the domain, so, really scored it there, right? And just to be clear for listeners, that's HAPI, happy.com. But that is not always the goal of the service which we're providing, which is active listening as a service. And so, in other words, we are non-clinical emotional support on our app. That's offering one. Offering two is actually selling that certification to the world and to businesses, because we know that listening drives better company culture, drives the bottom line. And quite frankly, listening is probably the most important skill aside from breathing that you can have in life.
Okay, that's amazing. There's some big statements you made there. I want to break this down just a little bit. So you talk about non-clinical emotional support as sort of one of the aspects of this, or maybe what sort of underlies everything that you're doing. Can you say more about that? What does that mean to say non-clinical emotional support?
Sure. So on our app, we have certified listeners, and anybody who wants to call in any time of day, 24/7, 365, can join our app and you find a listener. And you can either do a general dispatch and we'll find someone who's a good match for you, or you can look at the different listener bios, and if they're online, you can talk to them, or you can schedule a call. And these people are trained. They're phenomenal, by the way, John. They come from all walks of life. So there's not a specific persona that makes a good listener. So we have people who are doing this for their full-time work, and people who have fancy six-figure salaries and, work in corporate, and they just do this for fun. And it's really neat. And it's really in the training and in the learned skills over time that make someone a deep and good listener. And the key that we're training them to do is to, as the academic literature would say, is to listen to understand.
Interesting.
So
okay.
They are there for you. This is not therapy. And I want to be clear. We are non-clinical. We are not a healthcare company, and this is not therapy. We actually have clinical partners who support what we're doing because they refer to it as adjunctive care. It is in addition to the really important mental health care that they provide.
Okay, that's fascinating. So for somebody, you've been doing this for a while, but for somebody who's being exposed to this for the first time, this may feel a little bit strange. I'm calling a stranger. Like, how does that work? And how do you help people sort of get over that hump? As I understand it, you've got really great academic research supporting the fact that actually talking to a stranger who's been trained in this modality or way of active listening has pretty big benefits. How do you help people understand how this works and why talking to a stranger might be a good idea?
I think you hit on our number one product issue, so to speak, that we can talk about since it's a business show, is really how do you get someone from the concept of what they do is they go into the App Store and they look for loneliness, they look for listener, whatever the search terms are. We're the number one search, certainly in the US, for loneliness when you put it in.
Wow. Okay, that's a big deal.
Yeah. And so, but people are searching for all the reasons. They might see social media advertising, and then they like this concept. Oh, I can talk to someone else. Then what we see is, even with all the onboarding and education we can do beforehand, you get cold feet, or you get what we refer to as stranger danger. And so we have been working on all sorts of product innovations to get people to that call and be ready to talk to a real live human.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. And especially, this is such an interesting example. If you probably can use all the typical ways of driving product engagement and activation, but for such a huge and good cause here, right? Like actually getting people over the line to have these conversations, you have evidence that actually causes good mental health outcomes. And maybe you could talk for a second about some of that evidence, because I know there's a lot of academic research backing this.
There's a lot of academic research backing certainly listening, and
Yes.
listening that builds stronger human connection. And there are many different methods. In fact, this morning I was on a call with someone who runs a listening organization and is a professor of listening, and he has a different approach than one of our academic advisors who's highly published in the field. And so there's not necessarily one way. I think the most important thing is that you give people their space. You know, you could be someone who is a person, or someone who leads with inquisitive questioning in terms of driving the conversation, as long as you're not giving too much input. The things you want to avoid, obviously, are interruption and this idea that when you're listening, you're just thinking of your next comment, which is so typical. And so the key to what we do is teaching our certified listeners that they are there for the other person. It doesn't really matter what they have to say.
Yeah,
So
that's
there's
really,
there's a lot of research there, John. And then the other part of it is that we know, even with our certification, that strangers talking to strangers is a very therapeutic thing. They've done lots of research. Another one of our advisors, Professor Nick Epley out of the University of Chicago, is pretty well known for this. They've done 2 decades of research on airplanes, on trains, on park benches, in transit centers. And you are always overwhelmingly more delighted and surprised than you thought you were going to be when you encounter strangers talking to strangers. It's the very classic, I just spent 4 hours next to someone on an airplane, and once you hit the tarmac, all of a sudden you have a lovely conversation for 5 minutes.
isn't that wild? So this is that sort of expectation violation in a positive sense that gives us that lift and that feeling of like, well, that was much better than I could possibly have expected.
Exactly.
Yeah, amazing. I want to back us up here for a second to a word that you mentioned that is in the news a lot right now. You said you're the #1 search result for loneliness, and I think we were just talking about this actually before we started recording. I got an article, a New York Times article from my dad earlier this week talking about Vivek Murthy and Surgeon General and his sort of campaign to do something about this epidemic of loneliness. And this seems incredibly timely given our recording today and our conversation. It's a big deal, and it doesn't seem to be going away. And it sounds to me, based on our discussion, like you guys feel like you've got a big role to play, and maybe even in helping out some of these bigger picture, national ideas or agendas around finding a solution here.
Totally. So I actually want to turn the tables. And John, I think it's really fascinating, given the conversation, who your dad is and why he sent it to you.
Oh, thank you for doing that. My dad will be pleased too. Hey, Dad, how are you? Yeah, so actually, I do know something about this because of my dad. So he's actually a retired physician, a generalist for many, many years, and an academic. And his area of research in academic medicine was physician wellness. And not surprisingly, loneliness, burnout, depression, anxiety, all those kinds of things figure prominently in that research. And he I think, is the most published author in the medical journals in that space. So he and I talk about this all the time. We talk every Sunday, and this idea of loneliness and the epidemic of loneliness is part of the agenda most of the time that we talk. So thank you for saying that. That's great. He'll be pleased that he got a mention here. But let's get back to you here for a second. So tell me more about how you guys might be able to make a difference. Especially, I think you said, even on the national level, there's a role for industry here.
Yeah. So first of all of the research that your dad has discovered over the years is among the reasons why I actually quit medical school many years ago. And it's simply because if you look at that profession, as noble as it is to be a physician, if you just look at the rates, you really have to hedge your bets that you're not going to get burned out, that you're not going to become suicidal, that you're not going to get divorced and end up in debt, right?
Isn't that wild?
And that, most physicians today, unfortunately, are highly qualified clerks. Maybe AI will change that with better note taking in the and all the electronic medical records. But what ends up happening today is you're just doing a lot of record keeping. And because of how insurance is structured, you don't have a lot of time with patients. And I don't know any happy physicians today, unfortunately.
Oh,
That was not a
that's
pun either. So,
fair enough.
but that is a great point, John, which is we can now use something like the Happy platform, both in our training, in our listening academy for physicians, as well as the emotional support app to help them feel more heard and get that emotional support that they need. Say in the middle of the night, you're having that overnight shift and you just need to vent to someone. You're not calling your family. You're not calling your therapist.
Yeah.
Well, Happy listeners are there. And that is certainly a benefit that employers and insurance companies are coming to see as we begin to grow our company as something very important for their members.
Yeah.
When you mention Dr. Murthy's statements this week, and just so listeners know, we're recording on the first week of May in 2023. There was a big framework that was released. Most of the research that they're citing in the papers and in the op-eds is not new. This research has been around for years. I think the newest source that I saw was from 2020. He published his book in, I believe, 2019, his book called Together. So he's been on this tear for a while, so to speak. And I'll just say, from an industry perspective, I love everything he's doing, except the frustrating part is that government doesn't usually like to partner with industry. They're not going to suggest a company in particular. And so what you end up seeing are all of these recommendations, highlighting research, and then frameworks for solving problems, but not the solutions themselves.
Yep.
And so what we'd love to see from our government partners is exactly that, partnership to bring solutions. Like I mentioned before, we're doing this 24/7, 365. We are helping bring people out of social isolation and creating human-to-human connection. And it's important on the personal level, and it's important on the corporate level, and it's important on the national societal level, because right now we're seeing political divides that are far beyond reasonable. This idea of red and blue, and this idea that I can't talk to you because you put a certain sign in your yard. These are ridiculous things. What about just being neighbors? What about just talking to one another? We need to get back to a point where we stop judging and really start connecting with one another.
That's amazing. And I suspect that a platform that allows you to get emotional support from a stranger might play a role in healing some of those divides. If we suddenly start to recognize that stranger danger is maybe a little overblown in our minds, and that it's actually okay to lean on somebody that we don't know just a little bit.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of what happens on the Happy app. Because it's audio only and anonymous, we are creating connections that wouldn't otherwise happen in normal society.
Yep.
So, for example, one of our top listeners is a white millennial male police officer from Illinois. I won't say exactly where. Okay, so Midwest. He has calls with all sorts of other people, including regular callers who might say be a Black young woman from Alabama. Okay, these people in normal life, maybe even based on political views, even though that would be prejudging both people, right? Would never meet. Absolutely never meet.
Yeah.
Because of geography, because of age difference, because of all sorts of different things.
Yep.
And they are connecting on the most human level on our platform.
Extraordinary. That is really extraordinary. I mean, this gives me all kinds of ideas about it. This just feels like something that we all need, and that actually could play a big role in some pretty powerful healing. So talking a little bit about the government side here again. So industry having some sort of a role to play. How do you move the needle? Because as you said, governments are much more about frameworks than they are about actions and solutions. Do you have any templates from other things that have worked historically that you might be able to copy here, or what's the play for you guys?
The Happy Super PAC. No, I'm just kidding.
Fair.
Yeah, political lobbying.
Yes.
But even that, and I joke, but you can move legislation maybe by having a louder voice in DC. But, look at the Facebooks and the Googles and the Apples. The government is still not, just because they're there promoting their products, they're making it easier for them to function in terms of certain regulation. to get a government agency to say, hey, use this app is probably not great. And even if you thought about like, okay, maybe we can partner and white label this as like the first public health solution the government has ever released.
Yeah.
Well, now everyone's going to be suspicious. Is the government listening to me?
Yeah.
Right. So like, I don't know where to begin aside from being able to share space and time with some of these key opinion leaders.
Yes.
I'm not looking for them to promote our app and our listening academy, but it would be nice if they knew about it and would tell other people about it, maybe in large settings.
Makes a lot of sense. So that's a complex problem to solve. And I guess the good news is there are other pretty exciting vectors for getting the word out about Hapi. And one of them I know you've discovered in the last year or so is the B2B play for you guys, which was fascinating for me to hear about. That there's actually pretty strong evidence that this kind of emotional support and active listening actually leads to better outcomes on the business side. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we'll start there from our academy. So our listening academy is a self-guided online curriculum, often purchased by employers for training and learning and development. And so what you see there is you're going through the basics all the way up to the advanced level of listening to understand, and emotional intelligence. And when you do that, you automatically see people behaving and acting differently to one another on teams. This is super important for communication, especially with now decentralized remote teams.
Yep.
And it is also really important, as we talked about before, burnout and quiet quitting. We need to have a place where people internally can listen to one another. Now, the bigger part, John, if you're a business, is driving revenue. And the research is abundantly clear at this point that by listening, you actually make more money, because you could say listening has a lot of different outcomes, whether it's feeling better, feeling happy, feeling like you now have new friends. But at the end of the day, the research shows that the most important or the greatest outcome that you can get from improving your listening is creating stronger human connections, humans to humans, and those bonds. And that connection is ultimately and for many businesses, what causes a customer to buy.
Yep. Isn't that extraordinary? That makes a ton of sense. And it's funny because I think as business people, we like to think of ourselves, sometimes as unemotional and data-driven and rational, and that if we just present exactly the right thing with the right numbers, that's going to make the difference. But buying decisions, as you say, are driven still primarily by emotions, which is really something else.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and we've worked on our quite frankly, our customer workflow too, and I've done this in many other businesses, which is you'd think that if you just have like, okay, the salesperson, you hand off to implementation, then hand off to the account executive for the lifetime of the client. Turns out that most clients, you and I know this from buying the services on the other side as business owners, actually, because we build a bond with the salesperson, want them involved for your lifetime. So what I have told my team is, no, you're not the account executive, but you better be available for that person. They're buying because they like you.
Yes.
Right. So you're going to be part of implementation, and then you will always be available to them, even if you don't have the technical answer to their question all the time.
That's fascinating. So you guys are I assume you're actively collecting data on what kind of changes happen at an organizational level and at a results or outcomes level as a result of having people go through this program. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, we collect a lot of data. We collect all the data that we can. And then we share data with our customers also, or they share with us. So what we want to be able to do in every team is prove our success. And so that means that we can benchmark, say you take a salesperson who isn't trained and a salesperson who is trained, and you take a new person and a legacy person or a senior person in the company, right? And you see how they change based on their listening training.
Yeah.
And so what we want to be able to know is, did we really drive those numbers? And so far it looks like yes. And so that's why this is great for every team. Internal teams, for example, you often hear the classic thing is, oh, my product team and my engineering team just can't get along. And like, those teams need to get along. Well, let's listen better. Or my ops team and my sales team just can't talk to, they're at each other's necks. Okay, let's sit down and figure out how we're not listening to each other right now. But at the end of the day, if you're a business owner, you want to know that you're getting ROI on everything that you purchase. And so one of the first teams that we like to work with is actually your sales force, because there's always training. Quite frankly, there's always churn. And so you have junior guys all the time, guys and gals, and you want them to be the best trained. And they're the ones who are going to listen to sell. And so there's some really phenomenal stats. They actually don't come from us, but it's been in the market for a while, that it shows that a person who listens more, I think it's like you're listening, it's a 57 to like 43 ratio on your initial call, has a 120% higher chance of getting that second call and closing. In addition, you have, I think it's upwards of a 25% lower chance of actually closing a deal if you use a pitch deck in your first few meetings.
Isn't that amazing? And I guess is the logic behind that sort of depersonalizes it, or it causes you to go into speaking mode rather than listening mode, I suppose.
Pretty simple. Buyers want to be heard.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. What's fascinating to me about that is that research has clearly been incorporated into all of the platforms that track sales calls. So, Chorus and Gong display that very prominently. Here's the talk to listen ratio, and here's what the target is. So I think you're onto something there. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah. So first of all, I should just cite my sources. A lot of that research does come from Gong, and I this is probably not they are self-promoting, but it's great. They have a great tool.
Yeah.
We're not sponsored by them. We actually don't even use them, but I've used them before. And what they don't do as a company is actually sell the training that you need in order to optimize the numbers they're showing you.
Is that interesting?
Gives me a great business partnership idea. Thank you, John.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we're spitballing here, maybe create a little plugin that watches that, and then that like flashes, hey, you could get this training.
Yeah,
exactly. Move the needle on this number. Fascinating. Well, what I love about this, and I'm sure that this is something that drew to the business originally, especially given the history you described of deciding not to go into a profession because of the mental health, potential mental health outcomes associated with it. This is an example of something where something that feels really good and is beneficial to our emotional mental health also has outsized positive business incomes, which is not always the case. I mean, I think we look at something, the history of business, the assembly line had outsized, business implications to the upside, but maybe wasn't so good for our mental health and emotional health. This is a 1 + 1 = 3 kind of a thing.
I would hope so. So first of all, just internally, I was on a panel last night in New York City, and there's a few different people working on various versions of listening companies or conversation companies, and the host of the panel, the final question was, how has your work impacted you in the last few years since you've all been working on these various companies? And I will say that everyone has told me in my life without being asked that, hey, Adi, you've become a better listener since you started to work at Hapi. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because I'm in the training every day. I'm talking to the world's leading experts in this, and I'm actually, most importantly, learning from their modeling. I will tell you that one of the professors we work with, he's out of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Professor Avi Kluger, and I actually met with him in Israel last year. And sitting in a cafe with him was, aside from caffeine, there were no other substances involved, a euphoric experience. The way he listened, it felt like we were high on ideas, high on each other, right? And it's just like, when you get to that level of listening, you can accomplish so much in a relationship, in a business, and quite frankly, in society. So to get to your point there, John, about 1 + 1 = 3 here, what we're seeing is hopefully a societal change. We can get rid of these political divisions. We can get rid of this really hate that we see among various groups. And it's not just in America. It is across the globe at this point, because people don't feel heard.
Yeah. Boy, isn't that extraordinary? So let me ask you this, as a practitioner yourself of active listening, and as the CEO of a company that helps other people learn how to do this, what are some tips for listeners who want to get more involved in this or understand how this would work, can you give us like a couple of quick ideas that somebody could incorporate right away? And of course, if they want to learn more, they can also come to the platform and check it out.
Yeah, well, my first tip is take our course.
Okay.
Or if you run a company, let's
We'll
talk.
put that in the show notes too.
Right, exactly. And the other thing is actually get onto the app as well and be the recipient of listening. Like I was saying before, it is modeled very well by our certified listeners. And anyone who gets onto the app today, you get a free 15 minutes and you're good to go, and you can see if you like it or not. And that's on the direct to consumer side.
Yep.
But if you're really just thinking about it off of this podcast, the number one thing is breathe. Right? Center yourself before a conversation. We are so fast to start a call. I even think, before we started recording today, John, you and I had a little bit of schmoozing beforehand, right? And we warmed up and we were breathing a little bit and we gave each other some space. So that's number one. Number two, and the most important thing that you can do in any conversation is listen to understand. Really dive into what that person is saying. You can hear a lot of things, but you need to listen to understand. Don't think of your response while they're talking.
I'm guilty of that. I'm so guilty of that.
So that's a big one. And embrace the awkward pause and silence.
Oh, that's a good one too.
Yeah. So after someone's done talking, give that space. Let that last comment fill the room, fill your head, and then carry on with the conversation.
That's fascinating. Now let me ask, is your primary, the modality is by phone, correct?
It's on an app, but yes, I guess apps come through phone. Yeah, but it's like a phone call. Yeah.
I'm curious how the pregnant pause plays in that. Do people ever sort of feel like, oh gosh, are we still connected here? Like that would be my concern, especially in this day and age of interacting online. Whenever there's a pause, I always wonder, are we still connected?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've built a bunch of indicators into our user experience. The phone indicates that you're still connected. We show you, kind of like Zoom does right now. You can see your connection level. So we've built in those little indicators. We've also built in certain things on the listener side, so they have more information, so they can kindly ask, whether it's a pause or not. Hey, John, I see that your internet connection's a little wobbly right now. Could you potentially move to a place where you have a better cell signal or your Wi-Fi is strong?
Got it. So you've accommodated all these technical glitches that we are all living right now. So Adi, let me come back to the business use case here for a second. So what kinds of companies are the right fit for this certification process and for what you're describing? It sounds to me like sales-driven organizations probably are a great place to start because this has the most noticeable impact in a positive sense on sales organizations out of the gate. It also sounds to me like this is a fit for just about any organization. But where do you find your sweet spot right now with companies that can take advantage of this?
So we've seen a lot of interest in SMBs, small and medium-sized businesses that are a good way to kind of benchmark it is maybe they're a Series B company, so they have some cash still on hand. They maybe raised right before the great VC rush last year, right, where everything fell apart, and they're feeling that stretch in terms of growth right now. So there's maybe some communications problems. Maybe they're feeling folks are burnt out because there's just a lot of work and you're across the country. You're not getting those benefits of coming into the office. So that's a great place where we're starting with the academy. And like you said, sales organizations, if we're really going to target within the organization, sales teams are a great place to start. But also, obviously, the people ops, HR, they're the ones who are receiving the brunt of stress and complaints in the company. So we see that our heads of people's ops and HR really love learning about this because it helps their job. So that would be my message to anyone in HR is you didn't sign up generally to be the guidance counselor of the company, and we can help with that.
Amazing. Yeah, I see this as I'm hearing you describe it as an amazing tool for the wobbliness that's experienced as companies grow, especially rapidly. Like these kinds of issues that you're describing remind me of every single high growth business that I've been involved with over the years, right? That it tends to come down to communications issues that sounds like they could be addressed at their sort of foundational levels with something like this.
Yeah, so that's a big one. Now, The other side of that, we were talking high growth, is also all the riffing, if you will, that's happened across a lot of companies right now. So the reduction in forces. So you have everyone who's remaining, the 40% of the staff that's still there, is probably a little uneasy and feels shaky.
You're right.
What's going on with our culture? Are we okay? Are we stable? Did I not just jump on to start looking for new jobs immediately because you don't know when your job is going to get cut? So that's a great place for those types of things. I'll be honest that those companies are a little harder to reach these days because you don't know who to contact. You don't even know if that person listed on LinkedIn is still in the HR department, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a little harder, and they don't know, even though they might still have money to invest in their current people, they're not necessarily making these quick decisions right away.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole other world. So that was all about the academy. Academy often flows into, we need to offer this to our employees all the time as recipients of listening with right? On the other side of this, we are working with insurance companies and self-insured employers who are always responsible for the health of their members.
Right.
And if we're going to get into the healthcare side, this might be up your dad's alley, managed care organizations.
Yep.
And so there are places there where they essentially have to manage dollars and your health at the same time. So anything that can decrease costs and improve outcomes is really interesting to them. And we've started some contracts with large insurance companies where they'll say point blank, I'll pay for, 10 hours per member per month if that keeps a lonely person out of the ER.
Yep.
Because even at that rate that we're paying Happy, it's still a tenth of the price of having someone spend less than a night in the emergency department.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, this is sort of one of the benefits. This is kind of the Kaiser model, right? Vertically integrated system where they have a vested interest in the long-term health because, of their members, because it costs them money if they don't pay attention to it. Same in the self-insured category, I suppose. That's an amazing use case. Another place where this sort of alignment between, what's really good for your mental health and feels good actually being good for the bottom line as well. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And then so first of all, if you know anyone at Kaiser, please put us in touch because they obviously they are now on an acquisition tear. They just bought in Pennsylvania. So I think they're buying like 5 other healthcare systems this year. So this is certainly something that they need to start thinking about. And an HMO is a great example of that.
Yep.
So you mentioned some of these other places where we'll just throw them out there in case a listener, it strikes a chord for a listener, but something, law firms, lawyers need to be great listeners, med schools and health systems for this, again, from the academy side need to be great listeners. They all need to be heard too, but let's start with training for yourselves.
Yep.
And the big target that we're not necessarily going after immediately, but I think is huge for us as universities.
Yep.
Much longer sales cycle, but university students these days need a lot of help. As teenagers, they basically went through the pandemic.
They sure did.
There's so much stress online with every platform. You see everyone else living your best life that's not on campus, and it's their best fake life. Let's just be clear.
That's right.
And then just, the stress of life and being Gen Z. And if you talk to counseling centers on campuses, they are just so overworked right now. They can't meet the demand. And Hapi can help.
Isn't that interesting? So for the university use case, we're talking primarily then about supporting students in their mental health and emotional well-being. And I actually think, one of the best places you could do that is with professors. I don't know about your experience in university, but especially some of the more, let's say, academic types may or may not be the best active listeners. And so that seems like a pretty great place to start.
Isn't it fascinating, John, that you need a master's degree in education to teach kindergarten, but to teach a college level course, you don't even need 1 credit in education.
Wild. It's absolutely wild. Maybe the first credit they should get is with Hapi. As long as you have Hapi credentials, certification, you're welcome to be a professor here. I think that would be a good way to do it. Wonderful. Let me ask one last question on the B2B side, which is about the sales use case. So if I'm hearing this correctly, there are some really sort of direct connections between this kind of program and certification being a better active listener and business outcomes. And I think, you listed several of them. Now, the more I think about it, the more I can see, okay, if you're a high growth company and you've got these internal conflicts, especially the typical ones between sales and marketing, between product and tech, between finance and everyone, got these conflicts. This is actually something that might be able to sort of help reduce that friction. Anybody who's been in this high growth environment knows just how awful and deadly and soul destroying that kind of conflict can become in something that's high growth. What I really like about the sales one is I suspect you've got the ability to say, hey, look, on average, active listening salespeople are going to perform 7% better or 26% better or 11% better or whatever the number is. Now you're not talking about a nice to have anymore for these businesses. You're talking about a must have, and the cost for your platform is going to be a fraction of that sales differential. So I suspect that's something that you guys are studying and may actually have some research behind. But that sounds like for most sales organizations, this is going to be a must have.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, fair. Okay. Well, I wanted to get that out there as a plug for what you're doing. Adi, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm so glad we had you on and had an opportunity to chat. My dad is going to be so excited that he got a plug in this
Dr.
podcast.
Gerard.
And I'm going to run this through Gong after the show, and I'm going to see what my percentage was today. I'm going to see if I did my good job as a podcast host and ended up with 43% or less.
I love that. It should be the test on every show.
It should be the test. Adi, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. I'd love to reconnect in a year or so and see what the data looks like then. And in the meantime, everybody, please check out hapi.com. We'll have some links in the show notes. I will post what my percentage of talking time was in the show notes as well. And I'll look forward to connecting with you soon. Thanks, Adi.
Thanks, John. It was a lot of fun.